historical perspective to look at Chinese culture. Chinese culture, of course, as we know, well, actually every culture, if you will, you will have kind of ethnic cultural centralism. Try to, of course, portray China or Chinese at the center of civilization. So that's why you have all these so-called barbarians, you have all this, so-called Confucian, our Cynic circle, which basically include China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, or part of mainland. So other people outside this so-called civic circle were considered barbarian. So that's a historical explanation. But also we found some contemporary explanation basically from local rulership. For example, if you look at Chinese frontier rulership from at least the Qing dynasty, all these local or frontier generals, they tend to maximize their power by exaggerating the borderland threat. Or if you trace back to Tang Dynasty, of course, the most famous case is, as we know, the so-called An Rebellion, the guy who actually controlled huge military in northwestern frontier, and he finally even occupied Xi'an and the capital city. Then back to Qing Dynasty, we also have very powerful military general stationed in Yili, try to control the whole East Turkestan. Then go back to PRC period, we also see after 1949, we have very powerful military general in Turkestan, and also the so-called construction and development corps try to control the whole region. And all these generals, of course, they serve as governor, as party secretary, and also as a military commander. Unfortunately, if you look at all these local rulers or governors, especially, I think, go back to 1990s, you have very famous brutal guy, Wang Lequan. And then, of course, recently you have another guy, Chen Guoquan. Both guys are very famous for suppressing Uyghurs in Turkestan. Then some scholar basically said, okay, if you try to understand all this, political policy, you have to look at the individual factor. Wang Lequan, he built a very powerful network in Xinjiang. That's what people even joke. If you look at all these, construction materials in Xinjiang, they say, oh, okay, they just brought from Shandong. So that kind of corruption you can, imagine you have in Xinjiang or West Turkestan. Then, of course, Chen Guoquan also very famous, not only in Henan, but especially in Tibet, to suppress all these people. Of course, when you suppress all these minorities, you basically get political benefit. So that's why people always say, well, if you try to suppress no matter Uyghurs or Tibetan, as a local governor in Tibet or Turkestan, then of course you hope basically try to get promoted, especially into Central Political Bureau. That's the purpose for all these frontier commanders, if you will, or governors. So that's another explanation. But also you have other explanations. For example, some other Chinese intellectuals who actually are very much sympathizing with the Uyghurs. And I talked to them and I said, do you have any explanations of why Chinese try to suppress all this non-Chinese? Now, what's the benefit? If you claim all this region as part of China, why you suppress all these people? And one approach to that question is actually, some people say, well, if you look at Turkestan, the so-called Uyghur issue actually is not really a Uyghur issue, it's actually a kind of peasant issue. It's just like China, anywhere like Henan, Shandong, you have all this, rural areas. Of course, you have local corruptions, you have peasant, dissatisfaction, even protest. Then you said, of course, if you look at East Turkestan, there's nothing to do with terrorism. It's based about peasant issues. So you can imagine they have more explanation. But here, people basically look at domestic factors. And today, I really talk about actually external factors. I just try to look at different historical period and even context. For example, I try to understand why since 1990s in East Turkestan you have so-called anti-Three evil forces. Then after 2000, especially after 2001, why you have all this repressive policy in East Turkestan. And also recently we see increasing suppression of not only Uyghurs but also actually Hui, Kazakh, even Han Chinese. So I just try to understand all this phenomena from an external perspective. Now, first, I would like to say, if you look at from 1980s, two national campaigns became very much widespread when the so-called strike hard, actually from 1983, basically after the so-called open door policy, Communists really believe some so-called Western influence came into China. That's why you have so-called strike hard. But in Turkestan, this so-called strike hard actually became politicized. they're not really against criminal behavior, criminals. They basically try to target Uyghur from a political perspective. So that's a development. You cannot really find any politicization of strike party in Beijing or Shantou or other provinces. So that's the first development. And the second one actually is around 1989, China actually established so-called anti-porno, anti-illegal publication office. Now what does it mean? It means they want to eliminate Western influences, Western publications. In other provinces, I really believe they try to control this porno from Hong Kong, imported from Japan, Taiwan. But again, in East Turkestan, you will see they gradually politicized. They began to target the Islamic literature. Then after 2001, I would call this the second stage. Now while we talk about first stage, first if you look at all these phenomena, basically why you have all this politicization. My explanation is basically because if you look at it from late 1980s, especially to 1989, you have collapse of Soviet. That's why especially the formation of Central Asian republics really worried the Chinese communists. So that's why you have all this politicization of strike trade. You have all this politicization of so-called anti-porno, anti-illegal publication, try to control Uyghur Muslims. Then from 2001, of course, as we know, suddenly after September 11, China announced you have hundreds or maybe over 100 so-called terrorist groups, especially the so-called ETRN. And I remember a lot of publications, especially Xinjiang government, they released all kinds of papers, basically say, look, we have hundreds or thousands of terrorist attacks in the past decades, which year, which way, So what does it mean? It means they try to manipulate this event in the US, especially when the United States basically try to divide the world. Either you stand with us or either you are our enemy. So that's what, on the one hand, you can imagine, China was forced to select. You have to be a friend of the United States, which means you support the US way Afghanistan. But at the same time, China actually used this opportunity to try to suppress the Uyghur. That's why, on the one hand, they cooperated with the United States in Afghanistan. On the other hand, they began to suppress the Uyghur in East Turkestan, basically to openly attack the Uyghur as terrorists. So that's why if you look at here, after September 11, you have US-China cooperation, then you have so-called Chinese anti-terror war in its own territory, they call it, Xinjiang. So how can you imagine you have so-called anti-terror war in your own country? That's a development. And also from this time, we observed that actually the Xinjiang government became so-called anti-terror commander. So that's why if you look at all this policy, after September 11, I would say Xinjiang actually replaced Beijing to make all this policy, try to lead all this policy, try to influence all Chinese policy. So that's why if you look at after September 11, Xinjiang actually became highest authority in so-called anti-terror war. Then this anti-terror war, as we know, in 2001, not only you have US terrorist attack, but also you have Chinese cooperation with Central Asian countries, the formation of SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So that's what they try to extend so-called anti-terror war in East Turkestan all the way to whole Central Asia. So that's why you have all these organizations, so-called Uzbekistan Islamic Movement, Chechnya Movement. Now, of course, you already added the ETRM. So all these typical so-called terrorist groups now begin to be justified as terrorist group. Every country try to fight. So here, both US and Central Asian countries, they basically try to manipulate September 11. And of course, China did very cleverly, just to try to suppress the Uyghur. And of course, if you look at all these propagandas, especially from 2001 to 2009, actually there was a huge development, especially in 2001, I don't know, 2009, if you really pay attention to Chinese publications, in 2009, in Xinjiang, the local government actually formed a so-called Xinjiang Anti-Porno, Anti-Illegal Publication Office, which I said is already established in 1989. But by this time, they totally changed their rhetoric. If you read a Chinese article, Chinese newspaper, everything Chinese, they would say this is called 扫黄打非, anti-porno, anti-illegal. But if you look at China Daily, if you look at all this English propaganda, they said this is anti-terror literature. This is anti-terror publication. So that's why we say after 2009 in Turkestan, you actually have all this systematic confiscation or even elimination of Islamic literature, from Quran then to other texts, which they actually labeled as a terrorist or terror literature. So here, actually, I remember one day when I read all this article in Chinese, then my wife said, "What are you reading?" I said, Xinjiang government, they said they will have a so-called anti-porno, anti-illegal office. They were going to govern all 5 northwest provinces, which including my hometown, Qinghai province, which is the end of Tibet. Then my wife said, "No, you're not telling the truth." I said, "Yes." She said, "I read China Daily, and they said they are anti-terror literature." Then we actually compared the two, Chinese version and the English version. They actually use 2 sets of rhetorics. To international community, they said this is an anti-terror literature or anti-terror publication. Then in Chinese, they say this is the anti-porno, anti-illegal. So that's why from 2009 to today, if you look at the whole Northwest, not only Turkestan, but almost today to Gansu, Qinghai, Islamic literatures began to be controlled, began to be confiscated, even began to be eliminated. So that's a development. The other phenomenon, or the other phrase I noticed is actually around 2014, because from 2014, we see not only in Turkestan, but actually in Gansu, Qinghai, you have all this anti-so-called Hellenization. You will see on Chinese Weibo social media, a systematic attack on Islam. I cannot show some pictures here, but actually if you guys visit Chinese Weibo social media, you will see a lot of pictures, demonize Islam, demonize Prophet, demonize all this, Mecca. It's really a huge insult on Muslim and Islam. And government actually I would say quietly allow them to do that. So that's why I said after 2009, you will see all this, illegalization of Islamic literature. After 2014, you will see increased suppression of Islamic literature. Then my question is, why suppress all these books, no matter, translated into Uyghur, translated into Chinese, for example, Quran? My explanation is actually, if you look at from 2014 to 2016, one development actually is, again, one more time, not in East Turkestan, but actually in East Turkestan neighborhood, Afghanistan. But this time, not anti-terror war in Afghanistan, but actually the appearance of Islamic State in Holoshan province. Again, that's a very important development. From 2014, I said why Chinese actually suppress not only in Islamic literature in East Turkestan, but also in Gansu, Qinghai, even in Xiaolis, non-Uyghur regions, because they began to target Islam. So that's why today we see from 2014 to 2016, actually I would say not only Turkestan, not only Uyghurs, but probably you guys already know even Kazakhs, Tongans, Salas, they were arrested, sentenced, and actually I know personally some Han, some teachers actually at the school, they were arrested and now put into the so-called re-education center. And of course, we also know overseas students, not only Uyghurs, but actually Tonggan, Salas, they were arrested from all these Middle Eastern countries and deported to China. And I personally know some people already in jail. And also we know some Tonggan friends in Kashgar, they were sentenced simply because they put some Uyghur literature in their hotels, everything. So that kind of development. So my conclusion is, if you try to understand all this situation, repressive policy in Turkestan, 2 aspects. One is, of course, all these domestic reasons I will not talk about, since we have so many scholars working on that. Basically, to talk about all these external factors. The first one is the Soviet. The collapse of Soviet really, I would say, push the Chinese to implement a very repressive policy, try to control the so-called Uyghuristan, because they worry about if you have such Asian republics, you will have a Uyghuristan. And the second factor, of course, is the Afghan war. Here, of course, I have to say the United States, of course, made a huge mistake by recognizing so-called terrorist group
And of course, later on, if you look at State Department, they just deleted, then they added. So that's why here, the so-called terrorist group actually is kind of business between US and China. The third factor, of course, from 2014 is the Islamic State in Khorasan province. And I suspect this phenomenon probably will affect East Turkestan Uyghurs, but also Tongas and other Muslims. So that's why today actually I already heard some news that some Tongas were already arrested. And one case basically said one possibly Tonga Sava joined with IS. So we suspect this is probably a government, created phenomenon because they need justification, just like a Soviet, they need justification to profess so-called separatism. Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, then they need an excuse to profess so-called extremism. Now they need to profess so-called terrorism, which means if you look at, or if you link IS, SP, IS, or KP to Muslim China, Normandy, Turkestan, all these northwestern provinces. Then you want to, in the future, you basically have anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim movement in China. So all these external factors can help us better understand why all these irrational policies implemented, not only in East Turkestan, but now extended to northwestern provinces.
Okay.